That's a great story. You don't get to hear stories like that very often.
How are we doing on time?
We're a minute and a half away. We're good. Yeah, we could actually start, but I think I'll give it 30 more seconds.
I think there's still people on the Ann Patchett line.
Oh, are there
Yeah.
waiting to get their book signed? Oh, well.
Water. So I will get this around to people when they
When
have the questions.
we
and
get
I'll
to the
take them.
question, you
Anything
take
else
them.
you need
No,
me to do?
you want to stay and listen to them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, I'd say we're ready. Okay, folks, are we ready to start? You seem to be ready, so we're going to pull it off. First of all, welcome to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. We want to thank you all for coming and for supporting the festival. And although it is a free event, we welcome your donations. And for a donation of $20, you get to go home with a very special bag. Use it for your groceries. Use it for your books. Go buy a lot of books and put them in the bag. But we want you to buy the festival book bag and books while you're here. There is food. I can vouch for the lobster roll because I have one over there. Please help yourselves when this session is over. We are honored today to have with us, we have Robin Young. This is going to be our interviewer. Robin Young, who is the co-host of Here and Now, who I know only by her voice. But I feel like I know her well because I listen to her regularly at 11 o'clock in the Bay Area. And we have our author, Richard Russo, and he is here today. He's going to be talking about his book Trajectory, which is a series of stories. But as many of us know, he is the author of 8 novels, 2 short story collections, and the memoir Elsewhere. He received the Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls, and which, along with Nobody's Fool, was adapted to film. And not everybody can say that they had Paul Newman star in a film of theirs. So with that, take it away, and thank you so much for coming.
It would help if we had these. First, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to ask, how many of you have already had the pleasure of reading Trajectory? Oh, excellent, a few of you, but not enough that I think we should just set the table just a little bit, Rick, before we get to you. Because for me, Richard Russo is personal. Both of my grandfathers worked in the then booming mill town of Troy in upstate New York. One designed Arrow shirts. The other was one of the poobahs at Mohawk Rugs. In fact, oh yeah, I hear New Yorkers over here. Oh right, Oneonta. There used to be a billboard on the thruway. It was my grandfather kneeling next to a teepee with a little Indian. It was incredibly politically incorrect. Yeah. But Mohawk Rugs, it spoke so much about what the region was. The industry went south, literally moved south. The town was decimated, and my grandfathers were crushed. One ended up a Skid Row, no, it would be Bowery bum in New York. One died young of a heart attack at 50. I have always been in love with this part of New York and always wanted to know what happened. And my grandfathers were white collar. You can only imagine the blue collar, but we don't have to imagine because we have Richard Russo. His family was churning along next to mine in Gloversville, New York. They made gloves. You did a few shifts, I understand, as a young man at the glove factory. Just as gloves left Gloversville and rugs left Troy, that town was decimated as well. But from the rubble of those mills, we get these beautiful elegies. Mohawk, Nobody's Fool, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Empire Falls, the 2016 sequel to Nobody's Fool, Everybody's Fool, largely centered on towns with low self-esteem, the entire town. and centered on the men who live in those towns. As the New York Times wrote, few authors do male vulnerability as well as Richard Russo. But now we have Trajectory, his collection, as you heard, of 4 short stories, that takes us to the other worlds that Richard Russo also inhabits. They are Maine, academia, Hollywood, and we go to them all. In Horseman, you have a female professor who's taking on a snotty, entitled, plagiarizing college student, even as she's being kneecapped by her own memories of being told by a professor that her work just wasn't good enough, that she didn't exist in her writing. And she protests, but I do exist. Such a Russo character, but I do exist. In Voice, we have the Job-like Professor Nate, a Jane Austen scholar, but the students are only taking his course just to get an easy grade. He's not appreciated by his snotty, entitled college students. We seem to have a theme here. Or his own bullying brother, another Russo theme. In Intervention, a Maine real estate agent tries to sell the home of a young woman who plaintively wonders why things aren't going better for her because her father told her she was special. The agent also holding at bay some terrible illnesses and his backslapping entitled friend, Vinny. Yeah. Entitlement. And then, of course, you come to the gem, the one that's just getting raves, the one that we haven't seen published before, Milton and Marcus. It's based on a screenwriter. Did we mention that Richard Russo is a screenwriter who takes a treatment to half of the buddy duo in film that's the most iconic buddy duo in filmdom? And the actor that he takes the treatment to dies. Years later, the other actor comes and says, perhaps you can make this film for me. So the book raises many of the questions that we're used to asking when we read Richard Russo, including, why is it that some people feel so successful and so entitled and have absolutely no problem with that assumption? And by the way, we often like them very much. And why is it that other people know right away that they are not the winners of the world? That's one question. Another, because we have so much...
Wait.
Hold on. Another...
I'm in so much trouble already with the one, and you're moving on to the second one.
Another is, when you write about academia, are you writing about Colby College? And the third, of course, is, are the two actors in this fabulous piece, Milton and Marcus, are they Paul Newman and Robert Redford? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Russo.
Thank you.
Can we start there?
Start at the end and work our way back from specific to general.
Are they Paul Newman and Robert Redford?
Well, I certainly drew on Paul Newman for one of the two in the buddy picture. In my version, his name, this actor is named Wendell Pierce. Everybody calls him Wendy. So I drew on my both professional relationship, and I don't want to make it sound like we were intimate friends, but Paul Newman and I did do 3 movies together, and I had just enormous respect for the man and affection. He genuinely loved writers. And not just me. He had wonderful relationships with a number of writers in his films, he was incredibly generous to me. I think like the second or third phone call that I got the day that I found out I had won the Pulitzer was from Paul, and those phone calls it was amazing. It was announced, and then suddenly the phone starts to ring. In no particular order, the Bangor Daily News, followed by the New York Times, followed by a friend from high school that you hadn't seen in like 30 years, but then a gruff voice with no hello says, "Hot shot," and it's Paul Newman. Paul liked to call everybody younger than him. If he was male and younger than him, and he liked you, he would call you hot shot. So I got a very early phone call from him, And he was, as you know, so generous in every respect, not only personally, but generous in terms of what he did with Newman's Own and all of that. But for me, the most astonishing thing about the man was that he was so genuine in a in an industry that doesn't put an awful lot of emphasis on that.
That brings us to your second character.
Yeah. And but so for me, there's, and I've made a number of movies and TV shows now, and worked with some really, really good people. But for me, there's Paul Newman and everybody else.
Well, is the everybody else
Yeah.
Robert Redford? I mean, the New York Times writes that the second character, the actor who comes to the screenwriter and asks him to flesh out this film now for him, when the Paul Newman character has died, is as disguised as Inspector Clouseau. She says in the New York Times, it is Robert Redford. You adapted Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods, and Robert Redford.
I was one of the writers on Walk in the Woods. I was the last writer on Walk in the Woods, and you'll notice that my name does not appear in the credits. There's some guy by the name of Rick Kerb, who is one of the writers on that. And in the spirit of transparency, I will say that my film company, is called Kerb Productions, which stands for Kate, Emily, Rick, and Barb, which, by the way, is my wife and my daughters and me. This will give you just the size of the company we're talking about here. So yeah, I did. I was like the fourth, fifth, sixth writer on that project.
But Robert Redford was in that movie.
Yeah, I know what you're trying to get me. I know what you're trying to get me to say.
This
here.
is harder because he's alive, and for all I know, in a straw hat here somewhere. That character. Mm-hmm. Comes across as a narcissist. He tells a story that he loves to tell about how it tallied about $100,000 to get a margarita, crashing 2 cars, getting a private jet. He is not kind to the writers, the screenwriters. What's happening here? What are we hearing?
We're hearing that not everyone in Hollywood is Paul Newman.
Well, this is fascinating.
How you doing here so far?
Maybe I shouldn't have started with but it's interesting because you go on to say, and in fact, it has everything to do with what I feel, and you tell me if I'm wrong, you would love to observe as a writer, why some people have stardust sprinkled on them and some people don't. Why is it that the screenwriters are the ones struggling to drive up the mountaintop to see the thinly disguised Robert Redford, Nolan guy?
Yeah.
The words are so much important than what someone does with them. Why is
well,
it?
Tell that to the Hollywood industry. See how far you get. You're not even going to get as far with them as you got with me so far.
but you also point out that we love the shiny light around them. In fact, I think you have a passage.
Should I go to that?
Read, about
Then we can go back to the interrogation.
Is it Robert Redford? Yeah. Let's see.
And I'll just say one thing before that. I think that the question that you raised, Robin, is exactly the right question, despite my reluctance to answer it. It is the right question, but there's another one that interests me too, and that is that when the stardust gets sprinkled, what fascinates me is that it doesn't land on everyone exactly the same way. Okay.
How do we do this? Can you do that?
Yeah.
Set the scene.
This immediate is part of the scene that Robin just mentioned, in which the character William Nolan, who may or may not be an actor that you're familiar with, but is an iconic actor who has starred in several buddy pictures with another character in the story who resembles Paul Newman. This character has been telling a really hilarious story on himself about this quixotic attempt he's made to get a particular margarita made at a particular restaurant in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he's taking his bride. This is his second or third marriage, I can't remember, but he's taking his bride, and he's absolutely determined because he's been telling her about this incredible margarita. There's no margarita like it anywhere on the planet, and they have to go and get this margarita, but it's doomed. First, the brand new Audi breaks down on the highway. He rents a private jet. I mean, he goes through and then when he gets to Santa Fe, and promptly totals the rent-a-car. So when he totals it all up, or rather his new wife totals it all up, the price of the margarita is roughly $100,000. And this is the story that Nolan has just finished telling on himself. And here we have now the narrator of the story who's been listening to Nolan's margarita story. As Nolan was telling the story, I had the kind of out-of-body experience you sometimes get in the presence of people who are larger than life, or anyway larger than yours. We're used to seeing the William Nolans of the world on the giant screen, not sitting next to us in a restaurant. Close up, you can see what makes them stars and see that it's no accident. But writ small, their particular magic feels more like a parlor trick. Clever, sure, and you have no idea how it's done. But the part that gobsmacks you is that you're there to witness it in person. When people talk of being starstruck, what they're feeling is that something is out of alignment. Like they're coming in contact with something that they thought they understood, only to discover that they don't. The only cure, I knew from experience, is familiarity. Anything that happens often enough becomes mundane. If you have any doubts on that score, all you had to do was look at Marty, whose weary expression at hearing this tale of the margarita for the umpteenth time suggested that indeed no man is a hero to his valet. Marty had been a Hollywood producer, but I was beginning to understand that his real job was to produce an easier life for regular Bill Nolan. Locate the nearest airstrip, make arrangements for the private jet at a moment's notice, find someone to go to Durango to pick up the repaired Audi. In other words, to clean up messes that somebody else made.
Well, and as you write a couple pages later, you're a screenwriter. Did we mention that Rick Russo is a screenwriter? Starts asking, well, what's wrong with going after the thing you want, the happiness you want? He's got a wife at home. Thankfully, your wife is healthy.
Yes,
I hope. Yeah.
yes, she's here.
Yeah.
Or she's around somewhere.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
But your screenwriter has a wife at home who is dying from cancer. They don't have health care. They're hanging on until they get Medicare soon. He's, at wit's end. This famous actor could very well be optioning this film from him instead of just, teasing him through these meetings of, maybe we'll make this movie. And you start thinking, well, maybe I don't know. Tell me what the character starts thinking. Do I need, maybe it's okay to seek happiness, to seek the perfect margarita, to keep trading.
Well, I mean, and, as Americans, right, we're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And one of the things that this screenwriter concludes, I don't want to blow the story for you too much, but one of the questions in the story is, what happens when we feel entitled, as I think all of us do, the Wendell Pierces of the world, the Paul Newmans of the world, the Robert Redfords of the world, the William Nolans of the world. Because we're human, there are times in our life when we may briefly, and sometimes in a more sustained way, feel that we're entitled to more than we're actually entitled to. In the Hollywood game, that seems to happen on steroids, right? This idea, and it happens also to really, really good people. But you get into this world, and suddenly you find yourself asking for things that you don't really want. Robert Benton, my friend, with whom I have made a couple of movies and with whom I've had now a friendship of some 20 years or so, tells a wonderful story about Dustin Hoffman, with whom he made 2 movies. And the story that Hoffman tells is his first movie, probably The Graduate, the first big starring role anyway, was in The Graduate. And he was appalled making that Mike Nichols movie. He was just appalled at the things that people had done for them. You know, if you're on this, you have to have your own trailer, and your own trailer has to be fitted out in exactly the way that you want, and your every whim has to be catered to at every moment. And he jokingly said, you know, if you're a star, you have someone to wipe your ass. It's just there's nothing in this world that doesn't suggest that if you're big enough, you'll have your own private ass wiper. And he said, but the funny thing is, he says, that by the time you've been doing this for a while, by the time you're on your second, your third movie, and your name is moving up the marquee, and you get into a movie and you realize that your co-star has an ass wiper, what you say is, where's my ass wiper? Right? Because somebody else has one, therefore you want it. And that's the insidious thing that I find about Hollywood in general. And what I was trying to get at in this story is that when people behave badly, it's not necessarily because they're bad people. They have just somehow or other been seduced. And for this character, that's particularly for the screenwriter character in this story, that's particularly interesting because he himself, at a very important point in his life, probably would have been seduced, in the other sense of the word, seduced, had not the woman he was contemplating been a better person than he was. And so I guess the way I feel about all of these things is that we all have that. We all have that ability, I think, because we're human, because we're flawed. We're all tempted, and sometimes the seduction works. But in the rarefied world of Hollywood, it's really hard not to be seduced, not to be tempted every moment of your waking existence.
We'll talk about that theme elsewhere in the book. The people who are walking along thinking, how come that person has it better than me? I'm thinking of Nate, who I fell in love with, the professor who's wandering. He gets lost. He goes to Venice with his brother on a trip. He gets lost and sweaty. I mean, he's just sweaty and just lost. Yeah. His brother is seducing all the other women on the trip while bullying him. There's that sense of, how come his life is better than mine? There's the college professor who can't understand why another college professor has it, kind of easier than her. Talk about that sense of, as I said at the outset, the people who just glide or seem to glide, and the people who sweat behind and can't seem to catch up.
I mean, doesn't that seem like that to you? Doesn't it seem like that to all of us? That some of it, that we just, some of us, they just seem so damn lucky, don't they? My father had an expression for that. He used to call it shitting in a swinging bucket. Some people can do it. Most of us can't. See, this is when you grow up in places like Amsterdam and Gloversville, New York. You have colorful metaphors like that to draw on, really, for the rest of your life.
Actually, can I ask you about that? Can I ask you about your dad, Jim? And I want to mention too, it was your dear friend and longtime writing partner, Howard Frank Moser, who had you write the sequel, who convinced you to write the sequel to Nobody's Fool. I was sorry to read that he recently passed.
Yeah.
A terrific writer about the Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, terrific Vermont writer. But he actually, one of the best things I've read about you was his article, and I think it was Fiction Writer's Review. I highly recommend it. And he went to Gloversville because he wanted to see, where you'd grown up, as he said, with a disconsolate mother. You wrote about her in a memoir. Right. A dad who wasn't often there, but a dad that you've said was the beginning of Sully. Right. You're Paul Newman in the film character in Nobody's Fool originated there, and you've said it doesn't take a psychiatry course to figure out that writing that character Sully was your way more recently of spending more time with your deceased dad. Right. Talk about these people who shaped you.
Well, just to return to Howard for a moment, Howard was the very first writer who read something of mine and had a kind word to say about it. He gave me my first professional blurb, and sometimes life offers you. Life is mostly loose threads, let's face it. But every now and then you get to tie something up and you begin to see something like meaning, something like the shape of things. I dedicated Everybody's Fool to Howard because Howard was the person who kept, every time I would see him, he would say, "What's new with Sully and Rub?" And he particularly loved Rub, probably the most hapless character in all of Russo's fiction, and the competition is stiff. But Howard took a special liking to Rub and to that friendship, and I think our friendship, which we never talked about, was intimate in that way. But Howard, as I said, gave me my first blurb. And when I wrote Everybody's Fool, I thought there's nobody that I can dedicate this to other than Howard, because but for Howard harping at me for the better part of 25 years, I probably would not have written the book. So I sent him a little email saying that I was dedicating the book to him, and he was deeply moved, and that was wonderful. But it was also like 6 months. 6 months after that.
When he passed.
But talk about the people who have...
Well, I mean, your dad. First of all, for those, and I'm sure if you're in this room, you probably do know Sully, the character, but how did Dad come through into that character?
Well, first of all, like Sully, my father was a completely feckless and utterly charming man. He had the ability to walk into a room and have everybody smiling. There are scenes in Nobody's Fool that are entirely invented, and then there are others that I was thinking about my father and this particular gift of charm that he had, that are right on the page and then in the movie too.
Can you tell us one?
Yeah. There's my father had a particular way, especially with elderly women, of making them feel younger. He would go into a room and he would find a woman deep in her 80s and put his arm around her and say, "What do you say? Let's go dancing." You know, and this would be a woman on a stroller, you know, and they would look up to him and say, Jimmy, dancing," you know, but he had that ability with everyone really, but he did specialize in old women.
Did he really?
And there's a scene, and then there's a scene in both the novel and the movie when Hattie, who keeps wandering off from her restaurant and getting lost, she's deep in her 80s, and Miss Burrell sees her out the front window, and it's A Winter's Tale, and the snow is howling out there, and here comes Hattie up the street in her pajamas and a house coat and in her slippers, and she sends Sully out after him, and Paul Newman in the movie, who's playing a crippled man with a broken knee, comes hobbling after her as fast as he can, but even as an elderly woman walking in her slippers in the snow, she's probably faster than he is. He finally catches up to her and puts his arm around her and says, "What are you doing out here?" And she says, "I'm going to see my sister." And her sister's been dead for 20 years. And she says, "Wouldn't it be better if we went in the car? Let's go in the car." And she says, "All right, let's go in the car." And he takes her around the shoulder, turns her back towards the restaurant, and says, "But first we should go dancing." And she says, "Dancing?" Right. So that incredible charm that he had is all over both of those novels, and that was the principal joy of writing them. Since I didn't see him much when I was young, and got to be really good friends with him as soon as I became old enough to drink, and then not that long after that, he was diagnosed and died of lung cancer. And so these two books were among other things. I had some other things probably going on in my mind, but first and foremost was the joy of spending some more time in his company, and strangely enough, in Everybody's Fool, because in Nobody's Fool I owned the character. It was based on my father. By the time it comes time to write Everybody's Fool, and I'm thinking about spending more time in my father's company, suddenly, however, I realized that I didn't own the character anymore completely. Paul Newman owned the other half. And Paul Newman, of course, had died in the interim, too. So in writing that particular novel, in writing Everybody's Fool, I got a chance to spend more time with my father, but also I didn't realize until I was hearing Paul Newman's voice in my head, hot shot. Until I started writing the book, I didn't realize, too, that I was going to get to spend some more time. And I didn't realize that I'd been missing him, basically.
Paul Newman, the half of the acting duo that he likes.
That's right.
I'm going to get it out of you. But I just want to stay with your dad for a second, because I hear that there are some people here familiar with Upstate New York. And is it true that when you and Barbara were newly married, you went back to Gloversville and he met you, because Howard tells this story in his article on you, that he met you at, whatever, bus station, airport. Yeah. And he wanted to take you on the thruway, home, but he had no headlights on his car.
Right, and it was a snowstorm, too.
Yeah, snowstorm. So he waited at the entrance ramp to the thruway until a huge 18-wheeler came.
Yeah.
And did the time-honored upstate New York tradition trick of sneaking in and using the truck's lights.
Exactly.
Yes, I hear over here.
Or the tail lights. See, the wonderful, that was the other wonderful thing about my father. This is my wife Barbara, who was in the car at the time. This is also, was that the first time you met my father? Second time. Okay. Well, anyway, so she's thinking about marrying a Russo. And my father had come to pick us up in his beat-up Subaru, the headlights of which didn't work, and by the time he got to the Albany airport, it had begun to snow like hell. So he's going to take us home in an unsafe car with no headlights. And anybody else would have been kind of ashamed of, I'm meeting my future daughter-in-law, because I think he knew by that time we were pretty serious. And I'm going to be doing this crazy thing. I'm going to be taking her home in an unsafe car with no headlights in a snowstorm on the New York State Thruway. And in order not to lose the truck, we're going to have to tailgate. So we're going to have to be right next to the truck, because that's how hard it's snowing. And if the truck breaks, we'll break, and if the truck doesn't, we'll just keep going, and we'll get off at our exit. The thing that was so astonishing about that was that rather than being apologetic, his attitude was that this was a teaching experience. And he was saying, here's what you do. When you find yourself, this is my gift to you. Here's what you do. The next time you find yourself in an old beater car that has no headlights in the middle of a blizzard on the New York State Thruway, here's what you do. And he really viewed that. He really viewed that as a gift. He says, I'm
Did you ever, when you were growing up in upstate New York, just a quick question, when you were outside the city in some rural area and you approached an intersection, turn off your lights so you could just drive through?
No, that was okay. My education obviously was incomplete.
Okay. Because I did it until I realized, wait, what if the other guy's turning his lights off too, coming from the other direction?
I had a friend once who said that he always, just on principle, would drive through a four-way stop because... No, he would just drive through. He says, because what are the odds of somebody else being there that was that stupid?
Yeah. That's when I figured out they're probably pretty good.
In upstate New York.
Yeah. And we can say it. Look, I've got to ask you about academia. What are you saying about college students in these two pieces? In both of them, they are arrogant. They are demanding of grades higher than they deserve. In one, in Poor Professor Nate, the Jane Austen scholar, they get drunk in a class and have a bacon grease party.
Right.
Is that real? Is that a thing?
Oh, yeah.
Really? Tell what they did with it.
When I was teaching at Colby, and I taught at several institutions of higher learning, but at Colby, I went in to teach a class one day. It was near the end of the semester, and my students, this was a morning class too, like 9 o'clock in the morning, and clearly they were all drunk. and they had been to a party. They were not only all drunk, they also really stank in a kind of not an entirely awful way. But they had been to a bacon party, and what they were all doing was taking strips of bacon, rubbing their hands. This is not cooked bacon now. This is raw bacon right out of the package, and got their hands full of grease and then greased their hair back. The women and the men. So they had these. I walked in and saw this peculiar. I recognized them as my students, but they were clearly drunk. And what was going on with their hair? So yeah, this was a bacon party, and it was not unheard of at Colby College, and probably at other institutions as well.
But I mean, the one redeeming student in the two stories is someone with a terrible, well, at least she is initially, is
Right.
someone with a terrible disability. We're not quite sure what it is.
Yeah.
But she has to sit separately from the class, and Nate wants to try to reach out to her because her writing is spectacular, but he's not to reach out to her, he's been told. Have you had that kind of a situation in teaching where you are told that there's a student so damaged that
No,
okay.
that's I think probably the only kind of student actually in my tenure as a teacher. That's the only kind of student I've heard of things like that.
Yeah.
Where you would get a warning from the dean saying this is a particularly needy student, or a student with special needs, and this is a student that you really shouldn't call on in class. If she volunteers or he volunteers, that's fine, but otherwise do not draw attention to him or her. But this poor young woman is on the spectrum somewhere. She's on the autism spectrum somewhere, and her. What is particularly difficult is that she cannot be touched physically. She cannot be touched. And Nate is a professor who has not been particularly gifted as a teacher, who is in fact at this point in the story really wondering whether he has done the wrong thing with his life, because there was something else. There was something else that he was really good at. And he chose to do something that he wasn't terribly good at and made an entire career out of it, and is still looking for, at this point, the one student that would justify his career, which means that he's reaching out to touch someone who cannot be touched. And for me, that's the trick right there of writing stories, is to find some kind of circumstance like that. And you're not going to articulate it probably as clearly as I just did. But to find it, as you're thinking about the story, there has to be some element of impossibility to it. This cannot end in some sort of neat way. There is no solution to this story, which is a lot like life.
Well, I was going to say, and it's Nate,
Yeah.
who again, Job.
Yeah.
So we know that it won't go well.
Yeah.
But what are you saying about college students? I mean, in the other story,
Yeah.
the young female professor, and by the way, either we're being attacked, or I mean, a boat came up here before, so I apologize.
Yeah.
The female professor catches a kid plagiarizing, really easy to do. Same article, same essay she got from another student a
Right.
couple years earlier.
Right.
And this smug little
Prick.
thank you.
Yeah. Right.
Says, she says, I'm going to have to do something. He says something like, I'm paraphrasing, well, give it your best shot.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
What are you saying?
Well, I'm saying a couple of things. Colby College was the only place where I taught that was not a state university, and where most of the students there, either they or their parents obviously, could afford $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. And a lot of these students had come from places like Phillips, Exeter, Andover. So they'd had a whole. Now we're back in William Nolan territory again, but they've had. I mean, the bucket might swing for the rest of us, but it didn't swing for them. And they've had a pretty. They're used to. what I was astonished by when I was teaching at Colby, because I had really great students at Colby, wonderful students at Colby, and wonderful students too at the state universities that I taught. But the Colby students were completely used to and took for granted that my time was their time, because there was nothing else in their life to suggest anything different. Whereas my state university students, even the most gifted of them, kind of came to office hours apologetically. You know, you gave them the office hours and you told them they could come, but they didn't feel that they had a right to it. They would come in with that kind of, I hate to take up your time with this, but I'm confused, or something is going on. So part of what I was saying there is not about students in general, but about the kind of students that you sometimes run across in places like Colby. But the other thing too is that I have in my teaching years, I had a lot of women professor friends, and they said to a person that their male students treated them differently. All of their students treated them differently, but their male students in particular treated them very differently from their male professors. They were much more likely to file some sort of complaint. They were much more likely to interrupt in class. They were much more likely to act out. They were much more likely to interrupt their female classmates. And all of this comes down to privilege, and then of course too there is the political situation that we have today in American universities too. I don't think I could teach there anymore. I don't think I could. I think that the academy now is even more unpleasant than when I was in it.
This is a complaint from the right, far more than the left now, that the voices on the right aren't being heard on campuses.
Well, that was certainly true at Colby. And my politics, which are left of left, was very much in the mainstream. The only real competition at Colby when I was teaching there was just how far left you could go, and how willing you were to shout down any dissenting voice. Which is why when my daughter Kate was there, she has since come back into the fold. But when she was there, she was on the newspaper staff and was writing stories, and if you were an iconoclast, as she was, there was only one direction you could go, if you weren't just going to parrot the left and its attitudes. There was only one direction you could go, and I think that when professors and I knew professors at Colby, young professors at Colby, and Kate went to interview some of them who said I could never tell you, and at least in print, I could never say what I'm thinking because I wouldn't get tenure. So I think some of their complaints on the right are in fact justified.
We only have a couple more minutes because we want to make sure we leave time for questions from your readers. But staying with Colby for just a second, I was overhearing a conversation that you had. We know another female professor at Colby who's Jenny Boylan, who's a transgendered woman, one of the first to really become public.
Right.
And do I understand? Well, you tell me what a Russo means.
Yeah, this is Jenny Boylan and I are we were dear friends. We've been dear friends almost from the moment that we met. Jenny, then Jim Boylan, was the first person to welcome me to Colby College when I actually arrived on campus. We were dear friends. I was one of three people who went with her to Wisconsin for her gender reassignment surgery. We have remained dear friends. We were office mates back in the day at Colby. And as I was saying, that the whole when Jim came out as Jenny, just in the short period of time, 10 or 15 years since Jim came and told me that day that Jim told me that he was transgendered. In that period of time, thanks largely to Jenny and a couple of other really high profile transgender people, Caitlyn Jenner probably first and foremost, have of course encouraged other transgendered men and women to come out. But Jenny, not long ago, I was with Jenny, who said that who had told me that there is a whole new generation of young transgender men and women coming along, and apparently there is a term for a person who is straight, who will stand by you when you come out. If you're transgendered, if you come out, and you have, because a lot of people are going to turn on you, or a lot of people are not going to want anything to do with you. But if you have a straight friend who sticks with you, that person is called a Russo. Now, what's interesting about this is of course that nobody anymore, especially these younger people, they don't know the context for that. And Jenny overheard a couple of young transgender women talking about, one of them said to the other, isn't it ironic that Jenny Boylan's Russo was really called Russo? As I was saying, it's like that episode on The Sopranos where one of the mobsters remarks to the other, isn't it weird that Lou Gehrig died of Lou Gehrig's disease?
Well, that's something to be proud of. Something to be proud of. Look, and I see Deborah Tannen, the linguist in the audience. She's going, how words get into the language. Just want to ask, circling back to this chasm, the study of class, the questions about how come, or kids I used to know would say, how comes, this is how this guy feels, but I can't. And it's not necessarily that person has no morals. It's just that they are comfortable in getting and taking what they want, whereas you've got poor Nate who can't get out of a side street in Venice,
right.
To save his life, or who gets done in by a student that he tries to reach out to and
right.
touch, and he's just doomed. I mean, he's going to be doomed. You come from upstate New York. Can you put those people there, your sense of this feeling of this divide, into the context of the current political narrative today? Donald Trump winning. Donald Trump is, I was reading some of, like your New York character, Vinny, I'm not going to shake your hand, give me a hug. I mean, that kind of Trumpian, this is true, President Trump gets 2 scoops of ice cream at his dinners at Mar-a-Lago, and the guests are only allowed to get 1.
Right.
Without any compunction.
Right.
Put your observations in that political scene. How does it all tie together?
Well, I would go back to a conversation that I overheard with you, which was wasn't it a couple of people in the Amsterdam area who had jobs in, what was it? The mill?
The rugs. Yeah. My mother's family.
Your mother's family, and as a result of losing their jobs, one, you said, became kind of a skid row.
I say skid row, but it was for New York. It would be Bowery.
Bowery
Bomb.
A Bowery Bomb.
This is before they had homeless shelters.
And the other
heart attack at 50.
Yeah, the other had a heart attack at 50. Right. What's interesting about that is that, to me anyway, and which having something to do with the Trump phenomena and where we find ourselves in America right now, and it's not just Trump; it's the people who voted for Trump, of course. And
many of them from upstate New York.
And many of them from upstate New York. That whole Rust Belt went solidly Republican, and has always gone solidly Republican, at least as much as I can remember. But what I find interesting about it is that we always talk about this in connection with jobs. These people are angry because they've lost their jobs, and that's true. And many of them think that they know where their jobs have gone. Their jobs have gone to Mexico, or their jobs have gone to Indonesia, or wherever. But what drives people to become Bowery bums or to have a heart attack at 50, I think has less to do with jobs and the loss of jobs than it has to do with the loss of work and the sense that we have of ourselves as contributing members of society, where we fit in the social fabric. The town that I grew up in made at one point about 95% of the of the gloves that men and women, especially women, wore in the United States. That entire community, not just individuals, but the entire community had a sense of its place in the social fabric. When those jobs went away, people lost their jobs. They lost their income. They lost all of that. They began to worry. They began to be afraid in the economic sense. Many of them, because there was nothing else to do, many of them went on welfare. Many of their sons and daughters are still on welfare. But more than the loss of the economics, I think, is that sense that, and one of the reasons that so many people up there are so angry is not that they've lost their income, it's that they've lost their sense of their own importance in this society. And that, I think, as much as the economics of the jobs and where the jobs have gone and how we find new jobs and how we train people for those things, these people are suffering, I think, from a sense that that they don't count, that they don't matter anymore, and that their country has abandoned them. And that does need to be addressed.
Well, and Richard Russo, you give them that pride back in your books. We are going to entertain a couple questions now. Anybody have any questions for author Richard Russo, either this new book or the many others, or if that other guy was Robert Redford? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Question from a guy from Albany County, not
Yep.
a Trump supporter.
Yep.
I have a ridiculously long commute now, so I listen to a lot of books. So I wondered if you could talk briefly about the author's role in transitioning from print to audio, if there is one you have. And secondly, I'm in the middle of Straight Man right now, and your main character is about my age and often complains of feeling decrepit. So should I feel more decrepit and old, or am I okay?
Professor Devereaux.
Yeah. I will. Well, first, I'll just tell you a quick story. I'm glad you're reading Straight Man. Thank you. I still like that book a lot. There's a kind of karma. Thank you. There is a kind of karma in that book that I don't know will it cheer you to know or not. That's a novel. The entire novel is about a book is a book about a man trying to pass a kidney stone. I just had my first kidney stone earlier this year, and it's yet another sign of my decrepitude. But it was perfectly karmic. I thought that at some point in my life, after having made light of Hank and his efforts to pass that stone, that I should spend about 9 weeks trying to pass this enormous kidney stone to no avail. But the other thing, what was the first part of the question? Should you feel decrepit? Well, of course you should. I thought that went without saying. The audiobook. Yeah, the audiobook. I try not to do an awful lot of that. I read the memoir because I did the audiobook for the memoir because I thought that since it was such a personal story and it was about my mother and about our relationship and about this town where we grew up, and I called people and places by their real name, I thought that it would have been unethical, really, more than anything else, to have somebody else come in. I thought that I owed that to my mother. It was a tough book. It was tough for me to write. And if I wasn't willing to actually speak the words that I had written, that would have been cowardly. So I did do that. But for the most part, for other things, I mean, the people who do that, the people who read audiobooks, they're astonishing. They're so much better at that than I would ever be. And that's their living too. So let them do what they're good at and be paid for it.
Yep, we have one more.
I'm just curious about your history with Martha's Vineyard, because I know in Empire Falls, there's
Yeah.
a great deal about it.
Yeah.
And I think, your character was either staying at the Menemsha Inn or the Beach Plum Inn or
Yeah.
a combo of both. So
I just met the owner of the Menemsha Inn moments ago, or 15, or, well, an hour ago now. I just met her and had the opportunity to tell her that the first time I came to Martha's Vineyard, I was about 10 years old with my mother, and we stayed at the Menemsha Inn, one of those little cottages. And part of the reason that my wife and I and my daughters, who are now in their 30s, and now my grandchildren, have this relationship with Martha's Vineyard was that coming from this mill town that I grew up in, taking me to Martha's Vineyard, which my mother did when she had virtually no money. I think she probably had to borrow some from my grandparents to make that work. She wanted me to know that there were other places in the world than the place that we were living. And it was an extraordinary gift, really. And part of the magic for this island for me, it was that it was magical for her. So yeah, we have a long relationship with the vineyard right now, and it has something to do with the fact that it was absolutely magical for someone who could afford only 1 week here, but was determined to take her little boy to this place. Her ashes are scattered actually in Menemsha Harbor. Yeah.
I think that is a beautiful. One more question? One more? Right over here, and that'll be our last. And wait, we'll get the mic to you.
Maybe speaking on behalf of others who struggle to write, I'm curious about process.
Sure.
And research and even your day, how you structure your writing time.
My process has changed over the years. I don't work the same way at 68 that I did at 38. I have become grumpier over the years, harder to please. I was talking with Anne and Amor about this at our function yesterday, and I had this ability as a younger writer to just not care when I was writing if if the work that day stunk, it didn't bother me. I just figured I'd go back later and fix it. Now I spend an awful lot more time revising early on because those hulking, grotesque, awful statements, paragraphs, pages just ruin the rest of my day and make me dispirited about the next morning. And so I spend much more of my time now. I write less, but I revise more earlier in the process. I tend to write in the morning in longhand. I put it on computer in the afternoon. What was the last part of the question again? The research, yes. I try to do almost no research until after the book is written. And the reason for that is that I like to get the characters right first. I like to know who they are. I like to know what their problem is and how it might resolve itself. And if I've made the character a thoracic surgeon, I will write the book and then later on go talk to some people who are thoracic surgeons and correct all the idiocies in the book. But I'd rather do it in that order because I don't want to spend an awful lot of time not knowing what I don't know and thinking that that's what I need. Because generally whenever I do research, I throw most of it away anyway. So better to write the book, find out what I don't know, and then come back afterward and fix that. It can cause you some problems because sometimes it invalidates what you've written. What you find out later invalidates whole sections of what you have written. But still, it's nothing that you can't fix. And I think if Amor was up here talking about his research, I don't think he would ever dream of putting pen to paper, writing the first sentence of the novel. He wouldn't dream of doing that without knowing pretty much as he can find out about whatever he's writing about. Oh, Amor, you're here? Did I paraphrase you correctly?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, good. And on that note, In Martha's
All right.
Vineyard style, we thank you so much for coming and
Robin,
for
thank
sharing.
you so much for
and
doing
Robin,
this.
thank you.
Thank you.
Richard Russo will be selling his book over or signing his book over at the table. Please buy a copy.